Rules are rules, the administrator said, eyes narrowing at the black Labrador by Tom Rowan's side. The leash in Tom's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep his voice even. Emily Harper's diner didn't glow. It breathed. It wasn't the kind of place that pulled you in with neon promises or playlists designed by marketing teams. Harper's Diner sat on the corner of County Road 19 and Birch Lane, its white clapboard siding weathered by Tennessee summers and softened by winters. There were no fancy espresso drinks, no avocado toast served on reclaimed wood, just coffee so strong it could wake a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, pies that tasted like they'd been stolen from your grandmother's kitchen, and a wall of curling photographs, farmers in muddy boots, teenagers in Letterman jackets, and a whole shelf of faded snapshots of men and women in uniform. Emily had owned the place for 6 years, ever since she'd taken over after Jack died. Sergeant Jack Harper, tall, quiet, with a laugh that could cut through a bad day, had been killed by an IED in Kandahar. She never remarried. Instead, she poured herself into the diner, into the morning circle, a sacred ritual every Wednesday at 8 a.m. when veterans from Redfield and the surrounding towns would gather. Some came to swap stories, some just to drink coffee in silence among people who understood. Emily kept a mental map of them all. Who took sugar? Who liked their eggs runny? Who needed the corner seat near the window so they could see the door? It was her way of keeping Jack close and of keeping his people safe in the small ways she still could. That particular Wednesday, the story didn't begin in her diner. It began across town, in the antiseptic hallways of Redfield General Hospital. Thomas Rowan, Tom to most, Rowan to the few who had served with him, was there for a routine post-surgery checkup. He was a Marine, though the civilian clothes he wore that day didn't denounce it. The years had added silver to his hair and a stiffness to his left leg, but they hadn't taken away the unshakable steadiness in his eyes. Beside him padded Max, his black Labrador retriever, the dog's head level with Tom's knee, movements fluid, purposeful. Max wasn't a pet. He was a service dog, trained to interrupt the flashbacks and spiraling panic that could drop Tom into the kind of darkness you didn't claw your way out of alone. The hospital lobby smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Tom had just reached the elevator when a voice sliced through the quiet. "Animals aren't allowed in the hospital." The man speaking was neatly dressed in a charcoal suit, a laminated name badge clipped high on his chest, the kind of man whose shoes had more shine than his smile. "This is a service dog," Tom said, keeping his tone level. He'd learned over the years that measured words could be more powerful than raised voices. "I have the paperwork." "Doesn't matter," the administrator replied, without looking at the offered folder. His voice was crisp, final. "Rules are rules." Tom could feel the heat rising under his collar. "With respect, sir, federal law says otherwise. He's allowed." But the man had already called for security. 2 uniformed guards approached, their faces carefully blank. They didn't argue, didn't ask questions. One took Tom by the arm, the other gestured toward the glass doors. "We're not looking to make trouble," Tom said, tightening his grip on Max's leash. "Then you'll step outside," one guard said. The next minute unfolded in slow motion, the push of the glass doors, the slap of cold air, the feeling of every eye in the lobby fixed on his back. Somewhere behind him he heard a phone camera click. The guards left him on the sidewalk, Max sitting faithfully by his knee, watching him with those steady eyes. Tom stood there for a long moment, unsure whether it was the wind or humiliation that made his eyes sting. By the time Emily heard about it, the video was already online. She was in her truck, having just given another veteran a ride home from a medical appointment. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text from Mel, one of the Morning Circle regulars. "They kicked Tom out of the hospital. Videos all over the internet." Emily's stomach dropped. She turned the truck toward the hospital without thinking. When she arrived, she saw something she'd remember for the rest of her life. They were gathered on the wide front steps of Redfield General, a patchwork formation of uniforms and years. Young soldiers in fresh-pressed dress blues stood beside men with weathered faces and silver hair, their jackets heavy with ribbons. Some leaned on canes, a few stood ramrod straight despite the weight of decades. In the middle was Tom, Max pressed close to his leg. An old pickup truck rolled up to the curb. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. No uniform, just a gray sport coat, a Marine Corps pin on the lapel. His gait was deliberate, his eyes sharp. Brigadier General Henry Clark. Even in a town that didn't much care for titles, everyone knew his name. He walked straight to Tom, shook his hand, and said in a voice that carried over the murmur of the crowd, "Tom, we're not letting this slide, not for one of ours." The crowd shifted, and Emily caught sight of a woman from the local coffee shop handing out paper cups of steaming brew. Someone else arrived with a cardboard sign scrawled in thick black marker, "Service dogs belong." A police officer stood to the side, arms crossed, watching but not interfering. Inside the hospital lobby, the administrator's face was visible through the glass, pale now, eyes darting toward the gathering as if willing it to vanish. It wouldn't. At first it was just the veterans, 24 at most, talking quietly among themselves, their presence alone a statement. But Redfield was the kind of town that word traveled faster than the weather. By mid-morning, the trickle had become a steady stream. Townspeople arrived in work boots and Sunday dresses, some curious, some angry, some carrying cardboard signs with hastily scrawled messages. "Respect our vets. Max stays. Rules need heart." A teenager in a hoodie passed around a tray of biscuits his grandmother had baked. A man from the hardware store set down a cooler of bottled water. Nobody told anyone what to do. They just showed up. Emily stood near the steps, watching the tide of faces grow. She spotted Mel from the morning circle, standing shoulder to shoulder with a young soldier in fatigues. The soldier kept glancing toward Tom and Max, his jaw tight. At the top of the steps, General Clark stood like an anchor, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't shout, didn't wave a sign, he simply was. The kind of presence that made you think twice about walking past without acknowledging it. By 11 a.m., a local news van rolled up. The reporter, hair perfect and voice pitched for TV, began speaking into her mic, and her cameraman swept the lens across the crowd. The camera paused, inevitably, on Tom. Inside, the hospital administration pretended to carry on as usual, but Emily could see the strain in the way staff moved, quicker, tighter. Patients at the windows craned for a better look. A few nurses slipped outside, blending into the crowd, standing quietly at the back. Then the glass doors hissed open, and a man in a white coat strode out. Dr. Alan McCreary, chief physician. His tie was slightly askew, his brow damp. Emily guessed he'd been urged out here by someone higher up the food chain. He raised his hands for calm, though no one was shouting. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand there has been a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" A voice from the crowd cut him off. "You threw a Marine off your property." McCreary's smile tightened. "Our policies are in place for the safety of all patients. Federal law protects service dogs," another voice called. The camera swung toward him, catching the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Emily saw him glance, almost imperceptibly, toward the hospital doors, toward where the administrator still lingered inside, watching through the glass. Let's step inside and discuss this privately," McCreary tried again. "No," General Clark said, his tone like a closing door. "We're done with closed doors." A ripple moved through the crowd. The moment shifted. This wasn't a handful of veterans protesting an inconvenience anymore. This was a community telling an institution that its rules had bent too far. The news reporter angled closer to the general. "Sir, may we have your name and—" "Henry Clark, Brigadier General, U.S. Marine Corps, retired," he said, eyes fixed on McCreary. "And you can put this on record. This man was denied medical care because of the one thing that allows him to live with the injuries he sustained, serving this country. You should be apologizing, not explaining." The air seemed to sharpen. McCreary shifted his weight, glanced again toward the administrator, then murmured something about reviewing procedures before retreating inside. By mid-afternoon, the story had already been picked up by a Nashville station. Social media lit up with clips from the scene. Tom standing quietly with Max, the crowd's signs, Clark's voice cutting through the white coat's careful words. Emily stood at the edge of the steps, coffee in hand, feeling that mix of pride and fury that came when someone you cared about was wronged, but you weren't standing alone to face it. Beside her, Mel muttered, "They thought they could just shove him out the door and no one would notice." Emily shook her head. They noticed. She glanced toward Tom. He was kneeling now, one hand buried in Max's fur, eyes far away. She knew that look. Jack used to get it after someone said, "Thank you for your service," without really meaning it. The look of a man remembering both the cost and the indifference. Today, at least, Tom wasn't invisible. By the next morning, Harper's Diner felt different. It wasn't just the hum of the fridge or the clink of coffee cups. It was the way customers kept looking toward Emily, like they were waiting for her to say something. Overnight, the hospital protest footage had been stitched together with screenshots of Emily's own Facebook post, a still of Tom and Max, the words, "This is Redfield, we take care of our own." Her post had racked up thousands of shares. Veterans groups from as far as California had commented. But so had others. People who thought she'd stirred up trouble, accused her of trying to go viral for profit. Emily tried to ignore it. She poured coffee, slid plates across the counter, smiled where she could. But she saw the two men in suits the moment they stepped through the door. Not customers. The taller one, mid-40s, crisp shirt, company logo pin on his lapel, waited until the lunch rush thinned. Then he stepped up to the counter. "Mrs. Harper?" "Yes?" "I'm Brent Colson, Regional Manager for Franklin Hospitality Group." Emily froze. Franklin Hospitality Group, the corporate chain that technically owned Harper's Diner, even if they'd left her to run it as if it were hers. Colson didn't waste time. "I'm here because of a social media post you made yesterday. Corporate policy requires employees to remain neutral on matters that could be perceived as political or controversial." Emily felt the heat rise in her chest. Feeding a veteran isn't political. The incident you commented on has already generated significant media attention. Associating our brand with it could be interpreted as the company taking a position that's not permitted. She stared at him. "So what is this? A warning?" His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "I'm terminating your employment effective immediately." The diner went still. The only sound was the sizzle from the kitchen and the scrape of a fork in the corner booth. Emily untied her apron, folded it once, and laid it on the counter. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for reconsideration. She simply picked up her coat and walked toward the door. At the back booth, a man with a phone in his hand had been recording the whole exchange. Emily caught his eye as she passed. He gave her a small nod, the kind of nod that said, "This won't just vanish." By evening, that video was everywhere, not just local feeds, national ones. The clip was short but sharp. Emily standing behind her own counter, calm, while a corporate manager told her she was being fired for standing with a veteran. 2 days later, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, General Henry Clark stood there in a brown field jacket, the faint scent of coffee and cold air clinging to him. "Morning, Emily," he said. "I heard what happened at the diner." "I'm fine," I replied, automatically. "No, you're not," he said plainly. "But I didn't come to talk about that. I came to ask you to see something." He drove her across town to a squat brick building she recognized, the old community hall the county had turned into the Redfield Veterans Support Center. Only it had sat locked and dark for over a year after funding dried up. Clark unlocked the door and pushed it open. Dust floated in the slant of morning light. Rows of folding chairs leaned against one wall.
A bulletin board still held a faded flyer from the last time it had been used. Spaghetti dinner fundraiser, September 19. "We need someone here," Clark said. "Someone who understands honor and dignity, not because they read about it in a manual, but because they've lived it. You're that someone." Emily looked around the empty space. She thought of the mourning circle, of Tom and Max on the hospital steps, and the men and women who came to her diner because it felt safe. Her voice was quiet. "If we do this, we do it right." Clark smiled, just a little. "That's the only way I know how." In the weeks that followed, Emily transformed the building. Fresh paint, mismatched couches, long tables where coffee and biscuits were always free. A corner with soft rugs and toys for therapy dogs. A quiet room with 2 armchairs for the ones who needed to sit without speaking. Word spread. Veterans came. Families came. And slowly, the place began to breathe again. A month passed before Emily saw Tom again. It was early morning at the support center, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen as sunlight cut across the long table. She just finished arranging the week's flyers. Group counseling on Tuesday, VA claims help on Thursday, dog therapy every Saturday, when the sound of slow, even steps came from the doorway. Tom stepped inside, Max padding close at his heel. He looked lighter somehow. The lines around his eyes were softer, his shoulders less rigid. "Place looks good," he said, taking it all in. Emily smiled. "Better than sitting in an empty building." Max sniffed the edge of the couch, tail wagging once, before he lay down at Tom's feet. Emily poured 2 coffees and slid one toward him.
They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill the air. But then Tom said, "You're going to want to be here tomorrow morning, 10 sharp." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He just sipped his coffee. "You'll see." The next day, she arrived to find a small crowd gathered outside the center. Some she recognized, veterans, townspeople, a couple of reporters. But at the edge of the group, a white hospital van was parked, the Redfield General logo emblazoned on its side. 2 men in suits stepped out, followed by Dr. McCreary, the chief physician she'd last seen retreating into the hospital with the camera still rolling. His tie was straighter this time, but the tension in his jaw was visible even from a distance. General Clark stood on the steps, arms crossed, watching as they approached. Emily joined him, her breath clouding in the cold air. McCreary cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harper, General Clark, Mr. Rowan, I'm here today on behalf of Redfield General Hospital. We owe you, all of you, an apology. The events of last month were unacceptable. Our policies failed to reflect the respect and accommodations owed to our veterans, particularly those with service animals." Tom said nothing, just rested a hand on Max's head. The second man, one of the suits, stepped forward, holding an envelope. "In addition to revising our procedures and providing mandatory training for all staff, the hospital board has voted to make a financial commitment to the community we serve." He handed the envelope to Emily. Inside was a formal letter and a check made out to the Redfield Veteran Support Center for $50,000. Emily blinked. "This is unexpected." "It shouldn't have taken public outrage for us to act," the man said. "We hope this is a step towards rebuilding trust." General Clark's eyes stayed on McCreary, his voice measured. "Trust isn't bought, it's earned. But this is a start." Word of the donation spread fast. By that evening, the center's phone was ringing with offers, local contractors volunteering labor, bakers donating food for events, high school students asking if they could earn service hours helping out. Emily put the money to work immediately. She had the drafty windows replaced,
the HVAC system repaired before winter set in, and a permanent therapy dog program established with local trainers. The kitchen got an industrial coffee maker that could keep up with the morning circle crowd, and the long table got refinished by a retired carpenter who refused to take payment. Every week, the place felt a little more alive. Veterans started bringing their families. Kids played in the therapy dog corner while their parents swapped stories over biscuits. Some visitors came once and moved on. Others came every day just to sit in a place where they didn't have to explain themselves. But the real change came the first Wednesday after the renovations were done. The morning circle at the diner had been special, but here, in this space built for them, it took on a different weight. Emily watched from the kitchen doorway as Tom sat at the head of the table, Max curled at his feet, talking quietly with a young Army medic who just returned from deployment. Beside them, an older Navy vet showed a group of teenagers the faded photographs he carried in his wallet. There was no agenda, no speeches, just a room full of people who knew the value of sitting together in silence. Emily felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see General Clark. He said, "You did this." She shook her head. "We did this." Winter deepened. The center's lights glowed warm against the snow. Sometimes Emily stayed late, tidying up after the last visitors left, the quiet hum of the heater the only sound. Those nights, she'd pause by the front door before locking it, looking back at the room, the mismatched chairs, the long table, and the wall now lined with photos from the last few months. One frame held a picture from the hospital steps. Tom, Max, the crowd, the signs. Another showed the first therapy dog session, a circle of vets sitting cross-legged on the rug while a golden retriever sprawled in the middle. On the shelf below sat the framed letter from the hospital board, the $50,000 check's imprint still faint on the paper. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even institutions could change course if enough people stood in the cold and refused to move. It was late one evening when Tom stopped by, snow dusting his shoulders. He didn't take off his coat, just stood in the doorway, looking around. "Doesn't look like the same place as when you opened it," he said. Emily smiled. "That's kind of the point." He nodded, then glanced toward the photo wall. "You ever think about what would have happened if no one had been there that day?" Emily followed his gaze. "All the time." "Then maybe this is proof that showing up matters, even when you don't know how it'll turn out." He gave Max's leash a light tug and stepped back into the night.
The hospital's apology hadn't erased what happened. It never could. But it had funded something lasting. And in a way, that felt like the best kind of justice. Not revenge, not public humiliation, just building something better than what came before. Emily locked the door and turned off the lights, the room behind her falling into darkness. But she knew it would be bright again in the morning, full of voices and coffee steam and the quiet strength of people who'd been through hell and still showed up. 1 year later, Emily stood in a ballroom in Washington, D.C., her hands wrapped around a folded sheet of paper she didn't plan to read. The Redfield Veteran Support Center had been nominated for and won a national award for Best Veteran Outreach Project. The stage lights were warm on her face, and a banner overhead read, "National Veteran Service Recognition Ceremony." She wasn't used to stages. She preferred the smell of brewing coffee over the smell of polished wood and microphones. But General Clark had told her, "You don't say no to this kind of moment. It's not about you. It's about every vet who's ever needed a place to sit down and be seen." When they called her name, she walked to the podium, the applause folding over her like a wave. She could see the faces in the crowd, senators in tailored suits, veterans in uniforms that still fit, families holding photos of people who couldn't be there. She cleared her throat and kept it simple. Sometimes all it takes is saying, "Stay, you belong here."
That was it. No long speech, no list of names, just the truth she'd learned the hard way. The applause was softer this time, not because they didn't mean it, but because they were letting the words sink in. After the ceremony, she stepped into the hallway to breathe. That's when she saw him. Tom Rowan, standing a little apart from the bustle, Max lying at his feet. He was in a dark suit, his tie slightly crooked, but his eyes were steady as ever. "You clean up well?" Emily said. Tom smiled faintly. Max still thinks the tie is unnecessary. They stood together in the quiet hallway while voices echoed from the ballroom. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He figured this was the right day to say it. He pressed it into her hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting neat and deliberate. "Emily, that day at the hospital, I was ready to walk away from this town, maybe from a lot more than that. You didn't let me. You didn't ask for an explanation. You didn't make me earn my place. You just said, without saying, 'Stay. You belong here.' That saved me. I'm not the only one who'll remember it. Tom." Emily folded the note carefully. "You didn't have to." "I did," he interrupted. His voice dropped to a quiet rasp. "That's exactly what you did for me that day." Back in Redfield, the support center had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. The long table was always full on Wednesdays. The quiet room was rarely empty. Kids ran in the therapy dog corner, their laughter chasing away the weight that sometimes followed their parents through the door. On the wall by the entrance hung a new photo. The center staff and volunteers, veterans and civilians together, standing beneath a sign that read, "Here you belong." Sometimes strangers came in just to see the place they'd read about. They'd bring patches, coins, framed photos. Emily never turned them away. Every piece had a story, and every story had a place. She still thought about the hospital steps, about the crowd that showed up without being asked. It was proof that you didn't have to be the loudest to make a difference. You just had to stand where you were needed and refuse to move. One evening, long after the last coffee cup had been washed and the lights turned off, Emily stood alone in the center. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. She glanced at the photo wall. Jack in uniform, the morning circle at the diner, Tom with Max. In each image, someone had been given a place, a moment, a reason to stay. That was all she'd ever wanted to do. She locked the door and stepped into the cool Tennessee night, the air carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. As she walked to her truck, she thought of something Jack used to say before a deployment. "You can't fix the whole world, Em, but you can hold your ground in the part of the world that's yours." She smiled. Her part of the world was small. A diner once, a veteran center now. But it was enough. Some heroes wear uniforms. Some carry rifles. Some carry coffee pots. All of them, in their own way, are saying the same thing to someone who needs to hear it. Stay. You belong here.